probably the first thing that I want to talk about when I'm addressing you, Roberto, is that our relationship and kind of how it started off is that I came and saw some of your work. We made some connections over Twitter. And I think you're a primary example of what we're supposed to have in journalism, of the kind of person that we need to engage in these conversations of any subject. And that is why we are engaging in this conversation right now, because I watch you take evidence and I watch you analyze it and present the synthesis of it in your writing and in your podcasting in a way that actually captures the voices of Baltimore that are the real voices that don't get heard. And you're struggling to make them get heard. And those are like some of the very same frameworks and things that, I mean, I'm trying to do as well. And I don't know, I kind of feel like of you as a brother in the same fight that's coming from it from a different angle.
No, definitely. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it's... Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just that, I mean, I don't know. I want other people to see and appreciate why I'm having this conversation with you in particular. And that's out of respect and that I value your opinions. And I hope that lends some credibility to other people that listen.
No, absolutely. I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I think that's been it's been an interesting grind in Baltimore, trying to do this work and trying to elevate those voices that we don't generally hear from, and which at one point we claimed with great energy, you know, especially around the time of the Freddie Gray demonstrations and everything that occurred during that period. You know, we all were saying, you know, we need to hear from these voices. You know, we need to hear from the Freddie Grays, because when we don't, we create a situation where people feel frustrated to the point where they're willing to engage in, you know, rioting, or, you know, whether you want to call it an uprising or a riot. I know that is sort of a debatable term in terms of how people prefer to couch what happened on April 27th, 2015. But there's no question that in the aftermath of all that, a lot of the conversation was, we need to hear more from these people. We need to hear from these communities directly. And then everyone kind of went back to doing business as usual, right? Like, journalists don't spend any more time in the projects today just talking to residents than they did before Freddie Gray passed away and before the city erupted in some places in violence. And it has been striking to see how much, on the one hand, especially in a place like Baltimore, there tends to be a discussion about what we need to do, what we should be doing. And then when people start trying to do that, how little support there actually is or materializes for the work itself.
That is a super important point, and a wall that I imagine you keep going up to, as well as all the other activists, and I can speak personally, that it does seem that way. It's like as soon as everyone wants to say, well, what's the plan? And then you can present a well-constructed plan, and it's just silent.
Yeah. I mean, that's been, I don't know, I guess an eye-opening experience. You know, I mean, I've tried to really go out of my way to highlight voices we don't generally hear from. You know, and I think that I don't want to say there's no appreciation for that, but I wouldn't say that people feel like that sort of journalism needs to be a priority, right? I think people are much more likely to discuss your standard breaking news journalism, whether it's coming out of the city or nationally or whatever, and they're less likely to be inclined to sort of consistently follow a project where you're specifically trying to highlight voices we don't generally hear from in any number of political or policy or social discussions. And so that, I mean, that in and of itself has been interesting in terms of the dynamic of how something like racism plays out in a context like Baltimore, because it does speak to the idea that even in a majority black city, there's still a limited number of people who actually want to hear from poor blacks.
Do you see that as being like a further reaching extension of capitalism, or like what is controlling that money-making process? And I would love to hear like how you got to this place in Baltimore doing this work, because here we are, a Hispanic male and a white male, really trying to take the lead of doing the things that our compadres or the other people in our positions aren't taking up.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think for a lot of people in media, especially today, there's a lot of sort of penny pinching and a lot of decision making that revolves around the issue of revenue and profitability. I think that's hard to deny because, even companies like the New York Times, right, that have long-standing, incredible reputations, are struggling to match revenues to operation costs. And so there is a tendency, I think, especially for smaller media operations, which is generally what I've worked in, to sort of chase clicks and oftentimes sort of resort to lowest common denominator type of content or coverage, because the hope is to drive enough traffic to the website to be able to have sufficient advertising revenue, and maybe even if you're lucky to, charge more than you currently are able to for those advertisements. And I don't think there's any question that there's a reluctance to maybe try different things, to take risks when you're already kind of struggling. So there's that definitely playing a role. But I do think largely that we are conditioned in our society to think about voices and their validity in terms of whether or not they are credentialed in a certain way, or whether they are whether they sort of appeal to what we already are inclined to believe. And so, if you have a PhD, or you're the executive director of a nonprofit, or if you're someone who is a vocal activist who's out there regularly, well, you're a valid voice on these issues. But the idea that someone actually living the experience of a Freddie Gray is a valid voice, that, you would go up to someone who sells drugs, for example, and ask them what they think about their social conditions or how the city should better address their realities, is just not something we do. And in journalism, we never talk to poor Black people, in my experience, unless the person we're talking to has been vetted first by some sort of bourgeois intermediary, whether that's the nonprofit person who wanted to show you this volunteer who's going to say exactly what they expected them to say, or whether it's a union management person who's getting this worker and also sort of controlling what they're supposed to say to you. There's always like a vetting process that occurs that is supposed to sort of validate the voice of this person before they get to me, the reporter, who is then going to transmit this person's perspective or views to a broader public, right? But inevitably, because of this vetting process, I'm not actually broadcasting this person's views. I'm broadcasting this person's repetition of the views that this other person, this vetter, has essentially wanted them to have. And, whether that person believed that stuff anyway is kind of irrelevant. We can't say that it's a problem that these communities get silenced if the way we do journalism continues to silence them. And I think, especially in a place like Baltimore, you have to be able and willing to go to the community directly if you want to hear from them directly. And, because of the challenges that exist here, sometimes that means making concessions like, you don't have to tell me your name. What I'm interested in is your thoughts. Because a lot of people don't trust media any more than they trust police officers in these neighborhoods. And so I think it really comes down to what our commitment is to actually hearing these voices. Is that just something we say when, something troubling happens in our city? Or is that something we're actually committed to doing?
Man, Roberto, that is such a topic, because, that's stakeholder theory. So that's one of my biggest hard spells in implementing stakeholder theory in policing, is that those voices that you're talking about being heard, they also have to be heard in policing. Like, they're a stakeholder, a vested interest. And if we don't respect and value where they're coming from and their ideas, then we are like tyranny in an effect. And we're not we're giving that person that salad or that hot dog from McDonald's. So what I wanted to know is how did you get here, though? Like, that's the biggest thing that baffles people, is how a lot of people that look like us end up in this work trying to get people to listen to these voices. And we're hitting walls against getting people to listen. And then I think some of the people that we want to elevate the voices of, we have to deal with that distrust that they rightfully own because of all the other people that look like us who screwed them over in the past.
No, absolutely. And, I mean, I think anytime you're doing work like this on the sort of community engagement side of the equation, you have to acknowledge that these people, right, they subsist in a historical stream that is hundreds of years, right, in the making. And you're not going to like sort of show up with your good intentions and wipe that all away in one interaction or with a few interviews on the street. And so, I think one has to go in sort of aware that there is a longstanding historical trauma in these neighborhoods, and these folks are not going to sort of let down their guard just because in your own heart that you mean, you have the best of intentions, that you mean to do right by them. And that just comes with the territory. But, luckily, Baltimore's the sort of place where, like, I think people are very amiable and very sort of open to just striking up conversations, which certainly makes my job easier, right? Because it's not uncommon for me to be walking around a place like Sandtown Winchester, McKeldrey Park, or, Douglas Homes, and somebody approaches me with a particular type of proposition. And I'm like, no, man, that's cool. But, hey, I'd love to ask you some questions about, just some things going on in the city and hear your perspective. And not everybody obviously is willing to engage, and some of them don't want to be recorded, even if they're willing to have the conversation, which is fine. But some number of them are willing to be recorded, generally without their identity being part of the mix. But, there is an openness, at least somewhat, in terms of just like the culture of the city. But, the other side of that equation, I think, is where the real challenge lies, because I think we know that we're supposed to say that we want to hear from these folks. But, likewise, we're also carried in a historical stream where we've generally, discursively, ideologically blamed the poor for their own plight, right? Where we generally sort of want to treat the social issues that arise in inner city environments as a function of the people who live there, not a function of the history that they've endured. And I think getting people to that point, even people who are ostensibly on sort of like the left side of our political spectrum, that's a hard habit of mind to break, especially because it extends back through like our entire Christian inheritance in the West, and even I think in some ways longer than that. And so because we don't really have the sort of tools generally to understand like why we hold certain attitudes, it makes it really hard to get people to see their position as something other than a function of that same sort of structural racist stream.
That was awesome. I mean, you're right. That is exactly what happens. Is we blame them for the situation and the environment that essentially you don't have that blame, but white America as a whole does have that blame and that guilt that they create the system, put people into that system, and then say, "Oh my God, look at them and how they're operating in this system." It's perplexing. But like, how did you get to this path though? Like, what education? What leads Roberto to be in Baltimore doing this? I don't understand that.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of it, right? A lot of it has to do with my upbringing. I was born to two activist parents. My father was a leader of student protests at the University of Puerto Rico in the late 70s and early 80s, and part of socialist student movements on a colonial territory of the United States at the sort of height of the Cold War, right? This is still sort of like Cold War era, early Reagan, late Carter, everything that's sort of going on geopolitically. And you can imagine how being a prominent socialist student voice might play out in a colonial territory of a country fighting a Cold War in defense of capitalism. And so my father was kicked out of the university where he was trying to finish up his law degree. He was jailed at points. There was like secret police surveillance and files and documents being generated about him and my mother. And so we eventually had to leave Puerto Rico when I was 2 years old. And, we had the opportunity, an incredible opportunity for my father. He got to go do his doctoral work in political theory at Princeton University. But that's sort of like the start. I was the son of activist, Puerto Rican nationalist parents who were actually persecuted by the state. And so you can sort of imagine the values that I was raised with growing up, and the sort of commitment to speaking truth to power, as is often said. And, and I think as I sort of went through my educational path, I studied political science and history when I went to college, and, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with that. So I just kind of ended up on this very meandering educational path as I sort of tried to find what my calling was. I studied law first, and I didn't really find my calling there. And then I went off into the realm of religion and theology because of, some questions that I was sort of interested in. And I did a master's degree and then doctoral work. And it was really in the course of that doctoral work that I think a lot of the perspectives that inform my work today, that I really came into contact with them. I did a sort of post-colonial critique of early Christian literature that dealt a lot with the way ideological or discursive norms are formed to create certain truth narratives. And so I sort of, when I started doing this journalistic work, I was always kind of thinking in these terms, how are the things that we've become accustomed to saying over and over and over and over and over again, to the point that we recognize them as true, not because they're factual or because we have evidence to support them, but because they've become part of the rules of our conversation. When you say X, we all nod in agreement. And I think you can probably imagine how that plays out, and it plays out anywhere. Like when I worked at McDonald's as an employee, you quickly learn to sort of say certain things about the customers, right? There's a certain way you complain about them. There's certain complaints that you make, and everyone kind of nods in agreement. As a customer at McDonald's, you might feel differently about that perspective. But, there's always like these cultures that we get wrapped up into, and that we just start sort of speaking the language naturally. And that plays out larger in the context of a city or a country. Of a historical narrative. And, as I did this work, and especially after the Freddie Gray period, I started to feel like, man, I'm part of the problem. I'm part of the people who do journalism in these traditional ways that silence the poor. And so I felt like I have to do something different. I have to, if I say this is a problem, then I need to act on that. And I need to change the way I do things, not simply sort of say it's a problem, pat myself on the back, and then go on with my life. And so that's kind of how I got from A to B, I guess, in terms of doing this work and just feeling like if we're going to actually change this, then we actually have to change the way we operate.
I mean, when we have these conversations, we just said about the tie-ins and like how there's parallels, and you just laid out a whole bunch of other examples of how this is. And it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of blowing my mind a little bit hearing you make like a lot of these same connections. And hearing the way you grew up, I kind of understand why you're definitely further ahead of me now, because, I was merely baptized in it. You were born in it, so it took me a while to learn that. But you have those common threads of the cultural norms of society that are influencing your particular field. You have the education system in your doctoral studies really making a turn for you. It did the same thing for me. When you start realizing how to get to truth and isolating variables, you're like, wait a second. You start isolating variables and you get down to the truth. And our criminal justice system is that same thing. It's a religion. It's an ideology. And it sets you up to these narratives that you said. And these cases where you have people being wrongfully imprisoned, or you have them being pursued by the police on something, it's from those narratives as well, because we think of the black man as being bad and that hoodie as being dangerous, and then you get into that narrow vision, and it ends up clouding so many of the things that we do. And just how in journalism, like you're saying, they left Freddie Gray, so you make the stories, and they bring in the cameras, never getting the voices of the actual citizens, and they leave having that bit of black exploitation that makes the clicks, and then that doesn't do anything in the long run, because they don't ever come back. There's no follow up. But that incident made the mark on you that it did on me too, with Freddie Gray's death, and what he kind of was a martyr for represented so many things. And it sounds like it was a bit of your turning point, as it was mine, to say, like, we saw the media loop that CVS burning and paint our citizens as animals, when those were people we knew were not animals, that CVS wasn't burning for all that time, and it was right there in front of us, that all that anybody cared about was that white property being protected, and the only person that ever died during the entire uprising was Freddie Gray.
No, exactly. I mean, and it's, going back again to that question of media practice, during those 2 weeks, right, Sandtown Winchester might as well have been the center of the universe. There were press and media from all over the world. I'd be like standing there at the corner of North Carey Street and North Avenue, and next to me would be like a Russian reporter, and then like over here would be like the Spanish reporter from Spain. And, literally within a few days of State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby announcing charges against the officers, that part of Baltimore became kind of like this ghost town again, where only the residents go, and trucks, Mack trucks are constantly driving by and making it impossible to just sort of like hear yourself think. And so it quickly went back to this sort of like forgotten neighborhood that only industrial transportation sort of has to make cuts through. And we completely just went back to doing what we've traditionally done in the exact way we've traditionally done it, despite spending some period of time saying, supposedly, we're doing soul searching. This can't happen again. These communities can't be silenced. And it kind of reminds me of the autopsies that the Republican Party did after 2012. And, how do we do better in a national national general election, only to sort of take everything they wrote in those reports and throw it out the window and nominate someone like Donald Trump, who sort of plays to all of the limitations that were generally highlighted in those autopsies. And that's what it's kind of felt. And look, it's in any aspect of life, it's always sort of easier to do what you've grown accustomed to doing than to change or to try something new. But I think what has to be remembered is exactly what you said. The only person who died during that period was Freddie Gray, which is to say that to the extent that we continue to do our job the same way we did before that, we remain complicit in that death. And I think that's the thing for me about a context like Baltimore, is that when you engage the level of poverty that exists here, there is an urgency that you are struck with respect to the need to address it, with respect to ensure that no child ever has to grow up in a circumstance like this. But somehow the media has turned an utter blind eye, despite spending basically 2 weeks standing on North Avenue near the intersection of North and Penn and talking about, what these neighborhoods have gone through and yada, 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 yada. We just went back to doing the thing we've always done, and that has real life consequences, right? When we talk about the number of police settlements that the city has had to pay out, well, we in the media are partially responsible for that. We are complicit in a city and a system that abuses certain populations and then also silences them. And there's no question that we are part of that silencing, and that has to change.
Yeah, I mean, cool. The intellectual argument is pretty easy, it seems to make. And I like also how you talk about we get stuck into these patterns, doing these same things. And maybe that's what the doctoral thing breaks us out of. Because if anyone that does doctoral work, if you are repeating the things of the past, that is not at all acceptable. You have to be forging new territory and going into venues that haven't been gone into before. That's the entire purpose of what a PhD is to explore and push the field further into its evolution, which we need to adapt educationally as a society in itself. But the intellectual argument, I think we can make, and a lot of people understand it, but a lot of people's minds, including myself, don't change until we have that emotional pull. So I wonder if you had that emotional pull and what that emotional pull is that really convinces you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was just the realization that, I think it's fair to say that, especially in light of, my roots, I've always been more or less on the left side of the political spectrum. And that I've always sort of engaged arguments about social justice or about, the need to address racism or the need to address poverty or, whatever sort of popular thing people on that side of the political spectrum are accustomed to saying at any given moment and feeling good about themselves for. But when I started doing journalism specifically in Baltimore City, I started to realize how little any of those discourses touched the reality I was seeing, right? Like I had spent my entire adult life engaged with these discourses, but I had no sort of response to give once faced with the reality. And I realized how divorced a lot of the things those of us who have the privilege of being in more bourgeois settings say, how divorced those things are from the actual realities, how limited academic discourse is when it comes to even just giving you a sense of what is actually occurring in places like Sandtown, Winchester, in places like McKeldrey Park in Baltimore City. And I think for me, that moment, that realization that I am seeing something that is of an incredibly urgent nature in which I am completely unprepared to address or describe in any sort of meaningful way. I think that was the sort of shock for me that made me say, I have to find a way to do this more effectively and to take these values of, we need to hear people we don't generally hear from or, whatever it is, and to make sure that I'm actually living that out in the work that I do and not simply sort of paying lip service to it and maybe on occasion doing some work in that vein, but not making it a sort of standard element of my practice.
That makes perfect sense to me. And the whole parent thing, I wonder too, like if that's an exploration into like our families down as well. Like you have to advance that another step further from where our previous generation in this fight, whereas mine aren't biological, but those previous generations in the movement left a lot on the table that we have to pick up and put and make that ball go further down the street. But I wonder for you now, like, what's the step? What's the goal now? So we had this environmental awakening in Baltimore. Like we finally became aware of our environment, what's been happening, the history of it, the violence of police brutality, and the fact that we need solutions and we need voices to speak up. So how does that go forward for Roberto, and how can other people participate in that?
Well, there's a number of ways that I think coming up they'll be able to participate. But I mean, for me, really, I think the best thing I can do is to attempt to document perspectives from these communities about the social issues themselves, because I think persons who are actually living that reality are much more effective at explaining what that reality looks like than me as a journalist trying to sort of wade in that reality for a little bit and then try to describe it. I don't always know where to start, and I don't know that I always really capture it effectively. And so I think hearing directly from those people is really important. And so I think the most important thing I can do is to try to highlight those voices, try to package my conversations with folks in the community in a way that gets to the heart of what the challenges are, of what the struggle is, while trying to preserve enough of a distance to acknowledge that just because we are faced with a perspective from quote unquote below doesn't mean that it's the right perspective, right? It doesn't mean that someone from this community necessarily knows what the right thing to do is in terms of addressing it. But that they have to be included in the conversation, and that frankly our democracy suffers if we can push through policies and have entire debates around policy, but the people most affected by the policies aren't even heard from. And so I think that, we have to not sort of delude ourselves in the idea that, like, if you're from this community, you necessarily have the solution, but you certainly need to be part of the conversation that develops the solution, whatever that is.
That makes perfect sense as well. But what I am trying to dig out of Roberto is what drives Roberto. What is it in you? Like, I don't know. I'm just trying to push you to tear down that wall and be a little vulnerable to what it is that fuels you, because everyone out there has that internal fuel. Like every time I wonder why the hell I'm doing this, that video of Tamir Rice being murdered gets played in my head. And I remember exactly why I'm doing this. And his mere name can fuel me to go push the next level further. And watching you and how much you do things, and you do it without financial payoff, you do it without public payoff. You don't get a lot of credit for well-articulated hard work that synthesizes the big picture.
Yeah.
So there must be something in you that drives you.
Well, I mean, I think part of it is growing up Puerto Rican in the northeastern part of the United States, where being Puerto Rican is sort of treated like a racial category, not dissimilar to African American. And so you sort of, there's an extent to which I sort of see myself as a member of an oppressed community in the United States as a result of that, of largely having grown up in the northeastern United States as a Puerto Rican American. And so I think there's, some personal identification, but certainly I have to acknowledge that my relative social location insulates me from really most of the forms of oppression that Latinos or Puerto Ricans specifically face in the United States oftentimes. And so, I think the other side of it for me, just personally, I don't like seeing people be made vulnerable or taken advantage of because they are vulnerable. And it's hard not to notice when you're covering news in a place like Baltimore that the poor aren't simply neglected in terms of being heard from. They're also always like the political pawn. They're always the tool that a politician can raise and say, look at these folks and what they're doing, and XYZ, vote for me. And that really bothers me. It bothers me to see people abuse people who don't have the same level of sophistication they might have, for any number of reasons, who don't have the same access to resources that they might have, who don't have the same privilege and access to power that they might have. And I think some of this goes back to some of my religious background, which is not something I've talked a lot about generally because I'm not a particularly religious or spiritual person. But, there were points in my life where I was. And, one of the texts that always really stood out to me was Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, and Jesus is talking about at the final judgment, how he'll separate everyone into the sheep and the goats. And he says, the sheep are the ones who saw me in prison and came to visit me. They're the ones who saw me hungry or naked and they fed me or clothed me. And the goats are the ones who neglected to do that. And, he says, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. And putting aside the metaphysical belief in God or anything like that, I think that is something that has always stood out to me, that you are judged by what you do for the least, not by what you do for yourself or for those with the most. And I think that is part of what informs this work.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. That's what we leave, right? So, I mean, everything we leave and the mark we make on this world isn't how much money we put in our pockets. It's how many people we can help or influence or pay it forward to or whatever. And I feel that same thing you're saying about like Christianity, and that we say we're, as a cultural thing, like this is a Christian country and it has you see churches on every corner, but I don't understand why I don't see a lot of people acting like Jesus and being in neighborhoods that are marginalized and impoverished and fighting for them, because I'm 100% positive that if Jesus were alive on this earth right now, and that he would be on the front of a Black Lives Matter protest, not sitting there with a sign that says White Lives Matter, make America great again. And that's I find that incredibly baffling, and something that we almost have a moral responsibility as human beings to address, regardless of our motivation getting there.
No,
if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. No, I agree. I agree. I mean, I have a lot of feelings about our supposed religious inheritance, but it has to be acknowledged that religious inheritance, it provides rules for how we relate to society, right? And I think like the passage that Matthew 25 that I just mentioned sort of speaks to that, but it also sort of provides rules internal to the supposedly Christian community, right? And those rules might be in the form of, if you do something wrong, you're going to be punished for it. And right, that certainly our laws reflect that same sort of paradigm. Rules that structure your society internally are
interesting.
They're constructed in terms of prohibitions, right? Things you're not supposed to do, and if you do them, there's punishment. And so that inheritance also, I think, plays out in a lot of these dynamics in terms of the way we think about these problems. If you don't behave XYZ manner, then you're going to face XYZ punishment. And I think that speaks to our cultural inheritance of this idea of the rule of law. And I think it's sometimes that sort of internal aspect is stronger than the external aspect of our religious inheritance in the way that it plays out. In no small part because of the human propensity for moralizing. We love to view ourselves as sort of superior in some way or another to other persons. And so I think that has a great cost on our society, and one that we don't generally talk about because it doesn't play out in an explicitly Christian way, right? We do this sort of subconsciously at this point as a result of this long-standing intellectual inheritance. And so it makes it harder to address the problem because most of us are doing it thinking that this is just like a natural way to think as opposed to the way we've been conditioned to think because of 2,000 plus years of, Christian theological thought.
Yeah, you're always just full of a good point. That is a separate podcast we have to do. I've been surprised about the amount of pushback that I get when somebody says, this person should go to jail for this offense and be punished for it. And I'm like, punished for it? Our criminal justice system is not about punishment. And they're like, yeah, it is. It's like, no, it's not. What do we? It's like, you're right. That's what we do is we view it as punishment, and that seems like a very logical route. That it's eye for eye. It's you break this rule and you have this consequence. End of story. And there's no nuance to that. That's super relevant. I think I would love to highlight that later in a different podcast. So what do we leave then with Roberto? So what's Roberto's final word before we delve into elevating voices, before we delve into arguing about things, and we're not just sitting here being nice to one another the whole time? Well, what do we go with before we cut this interview out?
That's a good question. I mean, my only hope is that people will hear the other perspectives and give them the sort of weight and consideration that they deserve, right? Don't sort of reflexively listen to these perspectives and then quickly jump back to, some saying or bit of reasoning that just fits naturally within your current paradigm and that you're just used to saying. Really think about, what is this person's perspective? How has it been shaped by the reality that is theirs, not mine? And how can I sort of take that and either incorporate it, or if I feel like it has to be pushed back against, but on the basis of acknowledging what that reality is, right? Not on the basis of saying, well, in my reality, these values operate and predominate, and so therefore, why not X, Y, Z? We have to move away from that way of thinking and of discussing problems in our political context. We're too quick to demand that the values that come out of very specific context apply much more broadly than we reasonably, I think, can demand that they do. And so my hope is simply that people will view this as an actual conversation, not as an opportunity to sort of get the leg up and show your moral superiority to somebody else.
Damn, that's pretty good advice, Roberto. I think that's why you're a man that I've learned a lot from, and I hope other people learn a lot from that perspective, and we go forward with that lack of bias and ability to do something new. I mean, if we're not pushing ourselves and you're not falling on your face every once in a while, then you're not trying. And I hope that we can all try and take those lessons from you and go forward. And that's your host, Roberto Alejandro.
Excellent. Thank you.